Let me start off with just a question to kind of see where we are. How many people here would say they know an awful lot about the Iran nuclear agreement? All right. How many would say something about the Iran nuclear agreement? All right, good. We're in a good place. How many people would say they know absolutely nothing about the Iran nuclear agreement and accidentally stumbled into this room? All right, so I'm going to start with a little bit, just a little bit, of a review of the history of the nuclear agreement and how we got to where we got to. And that's not because I want to give you a lengthy exposition about what a great deal it was and why we went off and did it. But I think it's because it's relevant to the ongoing debate about the future of the nuclear. And I think there's a lot of confusion about why we did it, about what it was set out to achieve, and what it did achieve, and then what are the risks going forward. And then I'll talk a little bit about kind of what happened a week and a half ago when the president decided not to certify that the nuclear agreement is in the national security interest of the United States, and where we are going based on that decision. All right, so why did we do this? Why did we agree to relieve sanctions on Iran? A country that has, as we just remembered a couple of days ago, helped to perpetrate murder of hundreds of American citizens. And not just in Beirut, but also in Saudi Arabia, at Kobar Towers, and the maiming and murder of hundreds, maybe thousands of U.S. service people in Afghanistan and Iraq. But that's all true. Iran did, in fact, support a lot of the forces that were arrayed against us in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Iran did support the Taliban, and to some extent still does. Iran did, in fact, harbor agents of al-Qaeda, which are still operating inside of Iran, although the reasons why they're there and what they're actually allowed to do are a little bit different than what you're hearing about in the press right now. Why did we do that? Well, we did it because we thought that the biggest challenge that was facing the United States in the Middle East was the possible possession of nuclear weapons by Iran. It was our considered opinion, and this, by the way, is a statement not only of the Obama administration, but also the Bush administration, that Iranian possession of nuclear weapons would lead to proliferation of nuclear weapons to other countries. That the Saudis and the Emiratis would potentially be right on their heels, potentially the Turks as well. There's still some unresolved question about what the Egyptians might have been doing. So we were concerned about that. We were also very concerned about what Iran would do if granted the security of a nuclear umbrella under which it could hide. That if Iran possessed nuclear weapons, they would feel even more emboldened to take actions that would be prejudicial to U.S. security interests in and around the Gulf and the broader Middle East. And it doesn't take too much imagination to think about scenarios along these lines. If you think that Hezbollah is a threat to Israel now, imagine a Hezbollah that is guarded and protected by Iran possessing nuclear weapons. And Iran possessing nuclear weapons on missiles that they've possessed since the late 1990s that could strike Israel, could strike parts of Europe, and could certainly strike U.S. forces and U.S. bases in the Middle East. That is all in question. Imagine what Iran would do the next time there is some sort of conflict with them in the Persian Gulf, if they start to mine the Straits of Hormuz, as the Iranians have threatened to do multiple times, not just under the Islamic revolutionary government, but also under the Shah's government as well. What would we do and what would we be prepared to do and how would we respond to such an act, which is highly dangerous to U.S. interests and to interests of our partners and allies around the world? Even with pipelines being built all over the place to get oil out of Saudi Arabia through other ways, at the end of the day, the Straits of Hormuz, the Persian Gulf, are still vital to the global economy to get oil from place to place. And so from that perspective, we didn't just see the nuclear program issue in Iran as being one of many problems we had with the Iranians. We saw it as potentially being the bottom of that iceberg, under which you would have potentially all manner of various different illicit, illegitimate, or just plain bad behaviors that the Iranians could potentially pursue. And for that reason, the United States spent an awful lot of time around the world and persuading countries around the world to impose sanctions against the Iranians, to help isolate the Iranians, to put pressure on the Iranian system so that they would make concessions on their nuclear program. That was the main objective. And certainly that was the main selling point. I will tell you, I've been involved with US sanctions efforts on Iran since 2004. We went with the message of, could you help us impose pressure on the Iranians so they'll stop smuggling IEDs into Iraq? Most countries around the world had the reaction of, well, who told you to be there in the first place? And that includes US allies, by the way. We told our partners and allies we need to put pressure on the Iranians because they violate human rights and they do outrageous things to their population. Most countries around the world said, yeah, but have you looked at some of your allies? And by the way, not just your allies, but a whole range of other countries around the world. What gives you the right to be the arbiter of one country's human rights policy? Wasn't a terribly effective strategy. We went around the world and we said, well, we need to do this because of missiles and terrorism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And nowhere did we find any traction until we started talking about the nuclear program. Because that still, to this day, and weapons of mass destruction in general, I would believe as part of this, a major driving force of international response. Most countries around the world see it as a game changer, as something just substantively different than a normal acquisition of a tank or a helicopter or an aircraft carrier. They see it as something that qualitatively improves or qualitatively damages the security of states in a given space. And they saw it as a potential beginning of a broader problem. And so we were able to convince a lot of countries around the world to sacrifice their economic interests to help us put pressure on the Iranians. And we told them all, consistently, that our sanctions efforts were not about regime change. Our sanctions efforts were not about a covert attempt to use the nuclear issue as a way of getting at other problems. That once the Iranians had agreed to make the kinds of concessions on their nuclear program that we demanded, the sanctions would come off. That includes UN sanctions, that includes arms embargoes, includes a whole range of different measures that we imposed. And for the longest time, from a pressure guy's perspective, the Iranians did nothing but help us. President Ahmadinejad would talk about the Holocaust in the most disgraceful manner. It helped convince a lot of people that when the Iranians say that they don't want nuclear weapons, maybe we shouldn't believe them. The Iranians also helped us because they refused to enter into a serious and substantive negotiation, despite multiple attempts to do so after the initial European processes ended in 2005. And then President Rouhani was elected in 2013. And President Rouhani saw that the sanctions damage that we had in fact done to his country was significant, it was overwhelming, and it could not be corrected without coming to some kind of agreement. And to be clear that not all of this came from US sanctions. In fact, some of it came from corruption and a lot of stealing of the wealth of Iran from within the system, including by folks in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, people who were affiliated with Ahmadinejad, etc. But nonetheless, Rouhani saw that basically his banks were empty, that his system was in pretty significant danger, and most importantly, that the only solution to these problems was increased reliance on military elements within the society to command and control aspects of the economy. Something that I don't think he thought made a whole lot of sense, and certainly didn't think would further the revolution, and didn't think would further the system. Now, that isn't to say that Iran was inches away from being knocked off the ledge. One of the problems with sanctions is you never quite know how far you've gone until after you've gone that far. But Iran was hurting, Iran was severely damaged. And so they came to us and they said, how about a set of terms? We met with them in Oman, we met with them in New York, we met with them in Switzerland, and we eventually came up with the framework of an agreement. It was very simple. Iran will stop doing things, and we'll stop doing things. On the Iranian side, they agreed to stop engaging in a variety of different nuclear programs and activities. On our part, for the initial agreement, we essentially agreed to stop piling on new sanctions. We did not take off the ones that we had in place. We kind of held firm, but we also held easy on how much additional pressure we were going to bring to bear to allow a comprehensive agreement to be negotiated. It took 2 years, but in July of 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action emerged. And what did that do? It basically penned in Iran's nuclear program so that they are not in a position to possess nuclear weapons without us knowing about it well in advance for the next 15 to 25 years. Now, why do I give that range? Because over time, some of the restrictions and some of the monitoring steps that we put in place pursuant to the agreement will start to go away. So right now, we're in as tough a period of restrictions as you can imagine. Iran is limited on the number of uranium centrifuges they can have. We dismantled the reactor that they would build, they were building so they could make plutonium. And we also imposed a lot of limitations about the kinds of research and development activities that they could pursue. And all of this is subject to a lot of additional transparency and monitoring steps by international inspectors. Over time, those kinds of restrictions will start to go away. And in about 23 years, Iran's nuclear program will be treated essentially like any other in the international community. Now, this is usually where I see people in the audience gasp, because they say, but Iran cheated on its obligations for 30 years. Are you crazy? After 23 years, we're going to trust them? Well, the international nuclear system is not built on trust. It's built on inspections, it's built on monitoring. And the Iranians will still be subject to all of that in 23 years. The Iranians will still have to declare what their nuclear activities are about. They'll still have to provide access to international inspectors. And in fact, they'll have to provide access to inspectors if they say, we think that you're doing something that's up to no good in this place or that place. And so from that perspective, the nuclear agreement doesn't just give us a 10, 15-year security blanket. You can think about it as giving us a much longer sense of protection about Iran and its nuclear program. But I have to acknowledge, this isn't a set of permanent prohibitions. Iran's nuclear program will be different in 25 years. It will be treated differently. It will be treated differently by a lot of states in the international community. The agreement also didn't touch Iran's ballistic missile program or its support for terrorism. This is also where I see a lot of people say, are you crazy? Well, I already mentioned the fact that we didn't have a lot of international support in pursuing Iran over ballistic missiles, terrorism, human rights, and so forth. I'm potentially being a little too generous. When we initially started talking about missiles with the Iranians, with our friends, the British, the French, the Germans, with our occasional friends, the Russians and the Chinese in the room, we were the only country demanding missile restrictions, period. And our British and French and German friends came up to us afterwards and said, why are you bringing this up? We know the Iranians won't agree to it. We had zero international support to go after the Iranians in the nuclear agreement on missile issues, much less terrorism, much less regional issues. But we judged that was okay. And why we judged that was okay? Well, it's because we also did not agree to stop bothering Iran about said missile issues, terrorism issues, human rights issues. For example, all the US sanctions that existed with respect to terrorism, missiles, and human rights back in 2015 are still applying today. And a lot of those sanctions prohibit Iran's ability to engage in normal banking activity. In fact, they're having a lot of difficulty being able to do that as a result of the sanctions that we've got in place. And we also held out the prospect of being able to negotiate a separate follow-on agreement with the Iranians and potentially with others in the region that would seek to address some of these additional issues. Maybe an arms control arrangement with regard to ballistic missiles. Maybe something to do with regional security concerns, giving the Iranians the sense that they are better off operating in a more restricted space for their activity, but also not being subject to regime change threats and to the risks of being attacked from outside. And I think that there was still some hope that if all sides performed their obligations under the nuclear agreement, that we could have, potentially be able to get to that kind of arrangement. I've spoken with Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran, and I can tell you that his big concern was, tell me about the next 6 months, and then we can talk about 6 years from now. That's part of the reason why the President's decision to no longer certify the national security interest of the agreement is so problematic, from my position and my perspective. So let's talk a little bit about what that was. When we were negotiating the agreement with the Iranians, Congress was very concerned that they get a say. Now, technically, and as a matter of practice and precedent, we did not need to go to Congress to get its blessing on this agreement. It was not a treaty. It was not submitted as a treaty. In fact, it was intended to be something much less than that. In part, so that way we could withdraw from it if we ever thought the Iranians were cheating without having to consult with anyone else. But Congress was very concerned we were going to do something behind their backs. And so what they passed was what was called the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015, or INARA. Under INARA, the Congress first reserved the right to review and approve the agreement. And once that step was passed and the agreement was in place, they established requirements on the president and the executive branch to report frequently as to Iranian implementation and compliance. Now, there are lots of reports under INARA, but the one that the president targeted is the report that must be done on a quarterly basis, every 90 days. And in it, there are two certifications the president has to make. First, the president has to certify that Iran is not cheating. There are like 3 different ways in which the president has to certify it, but that's essentially what it is. The other part is the president has to certify that continued sanctions relief is in the U.S. national security interest. In other words, the nuclear agreement is worth us not being able to impose oil sanctions on Iran, us being able to impose transportation sanctions on Iran, right? And that all of the relief that we provide in the agreement is still worth giving. It's this piece that the president refused to do on October 13th. In fact, his own Secretary of State, his own Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of STRATCOM, and various different aspects of the intelligence community have all said Iran is complying with the agreement. The concern is that we didn't address all these other problems. And we also don't have a permanent set of restrictions on Iran. For that reason, what the president has said is, I want a better deal. And he said that he is charging Congress with helping to establish the conditions for that better deal, and our European partners in particular for getting on board a more aggressive pressure track with the Iranians so as to force them to accept that better deal. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what's going to happen now. First, let's start with Congress. Congress has got 60 days, essentially, to decide what it wants to do. They can do one of 3 things. One, they can snap back all the sanctions that we took away pursuant to the agreement. They can pass a law that says all the sanctions that were suspended are back in force. That's it. If they do that, they don't have to filibuster, or deal with the filibuster rather. They don't have to go through the committee process, aside from a 3-day kind of pro forma process that they don't even have to follow if they don't want to. And they only have to accept 10 hours of debate. In other words, Congress could have all of our sanctions back in place against Iran now by the 9th or so of November. Okay? Congress seems very unlikely to do this. And that's in large part because even people who were opposed to the agreement 2 years ago when we were negotiating it have come to see that Iran's nuclear program being a year away from nuclear weapons is a lot better than 2 to 3 months. I wish they'd said that 2 years ago. But that doesn't mean Congress is necessarily going to do nothing, which is another option. They also have the option, if they wish to pass other legislation. They're Congress. They can pass legislation if they want to. And there are a couple different options that they're now discussing. The first is to just impose additional sanctions on Iran. Make them focused on missiles, make them focused on terrorism, make them focused on human rights, Hezbollah, just throw other things at the Iranians. Candidly, we've already done as much on sanctions towards Iran in those areas as we're going to be able to do. There is not a lot left in that realm. I'm happy to talk about the specifics when we go back and forth. The other option that Congress has is to change the terms of INARA. See, it seems that one of the concerns that the president has is not necessarily with the nuclear agreement, but the fact that every 90 days he has to say something nice about it. And according to the Washington Post, the president vented to his staff that he needs to get out of having to make these certifications. That's his primary objective. And so one of the ideas that's being discussed essentially would take away the certification requirement and replace it with a set of automatic triggers. If Iran centrifuges go from this number to this number, sanctions are imposed. If Iran tests a ballistic missile capable of housing a nuclear warhead, that would trigger snapback. If Iran were to possess more amount of enriched uranium or heavy water than it has right now, that would trigger snapback, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea essentially is to take the president's hands off the steering wheel and instead replace it with dead hands approach, right? Where there isn't anything that actually has to be done. It's all simply a matter of if condition A, then condition B. That is not an optimal setup, especially when you're dealing with a highly technical agreement. And it's part of the reason why Congress, even though they're thinking about this now, is extensively debated. And there's a lot of concern about unforeseen and unforeseeable outcomes if that were in fact to go forward. Part of the problem, though, is the president has already said that he reserves the right to walk away from the agreement altogether if Congress doesn't do something. We need to not define what the something is. So there is a lot of pressure on Congress to do something. And the key question now is, what? Let's talk a little bit about our European and Asian allies. They are not happy with our choices. And they are very concerned about the decision on the part of the president to decertify the agreement with respect to Iran. They believe, and I feel comfortable speaking broadly since they've come out in public in various different fora, including the European Council of all 28 members of the EU, as well as individually, that the nuclear agreement is being faithfully implemented by the Iranians, and it should be faithfully implemented by the Americans. Fairly simple interpretation, fairly simple approach. They're very concerned about what a decision to walk away from the agreement might do, and they're very concerned that the United States doesn't quite have a handle on how to control all the unforeseen and unforeseeable outcomes that have now started to come up as a result of this process. And so right now, they're engaged in a very careful discussion about whether or not there is something that they can do that can convince the administration to step back from the ledge. And that is still a bit of an open question. As for our Asian partners, they are also pretty concerned about what we're going to do, especially if we're talking about Japan and Korea, in no small part because they're concerned that we're losing our focus. And they see an active nuclear crisis with North Korea, and they are very concerned that we are not going to be paying attention to that in deference to Iran. They're also concerned that if we were to go down a sanctions path with regard to North Korea, that we would lose China if we also tried to add on Iran as well. And they see the concerns with that. So there's a lot of questions really about what the U.S. is going to do, and a lot of concerns that we don't quite yet understand all the outcomes that we have. And this takes me to the last point, which is Iran. There is a worrying tendency in Washington to believe the United States can push the Iranians and the Iranians will not react. There is also a worrying tendency on the part of the president, and frankly the Secretary of State, that the Iranians should be grateful for the nuclear agreement that we fashioned with them, and so therefore, out of gratitude, they should accept our demands for more. That's not terribly feasible. It also betrays a lack of understanding of Iran, culturally as well as politically. The bigger problem is, you could kind of get past the fact that there is misunderstanding about Iran if it weren't for the fact that the United States is also threatening regime change. And so it's not simply that we are threatening to undo an agreement the Iranian political system has been able to embrace, but we're actively talking about what we can do to topple that government. And this isn't just simply something that's being said in the think tank circuit in Washington, but there are key advisors to the president who have flat out said that an agreement with the Iranians is not worth the paper it's written. In fact, the ambassador to the United Nations has made that oft recited parable about the scorpion. We've all heard this one about how you can't blame the scorpion when it stings because it's in its nature. That is part of the underpinning of a lot of philosophy that is attached to this administration with respect to Iran, and that no agreement will work, and so therefore the only thing to do is to change the government. Even if we don't do that, if our present sanctions and our present approach to the nuclear agreement remains on course, I think you're going to see a lot of businesses retreating from war. They're not stupid. They know that they risk a lot if the United States reverts to an active sanctions posture. And so from that perspective, they're going to start protecting themselves by getting out of the Iranian market. So even if we don't walk away ourselves, one of our biggest problems is that businesses will. And if they do that, the Iranians lose all the economic incentives that are keeping that nuclear program under restraint. So right now, I think we're at a tremendous moment. We're at a moment in which, if we persist with our present course, we run the risk of Iran's nuclear program reverting to what it was in 2015, which I don't think is in the U.S. national security interest. and at the same time having all of these other problems with Iran that we are concerned about now. Terrorism, human rights, ballistic missiles, etc. And without a feasible way of bringing the international community together again to go after the Iranians. I am no fan of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I spent an awful lot of my life harrying their nuclear program as well as them for a variety of crimes. But I do think that there is something to be said for trying to approach the situation with a little bit more care, a little bit more nuance, and a little bit more respect for the unintended consequences of our policies. And I think that's an element of the discussion in Washington that at this point is still sort of lacking. So with that, I can see that I've made you all very happy and pleased. Everyone seems excited. Let me stop. I'd love to hear your thoughts and to have a bit of a discussion about what you think we ought to be doing going forward.
Yes, we'll do. We'll take questions back and forth either side, so if you raise your hands, we'll get the mic.
You mentioned the famous line by the president that he can just walk away from this. And there's been some, I've read varying degrees of arguments going one way or the other, and I just wonder whether you could clarify whether it indeed is illegal for him to do that, essentially abrogating the treaty.
So it's a great question, and usually it hinges on two interpretations of the agreement. Federica Mogherini, who's head of foreign policy for the EU, she is very firm in saying this is a multilateral agreement and not one state can pull out of it. Or rather, not one state can kill the agreement. One state can pull out of it, but they can't kill it. That is true in terms of, is there a piece of paper that says JCPOA on it, to which countries are signatories? The problem, this goes to Trump's main argument here. When you get right down to it, the agreement was paid for with U.S. sanctions relief. The structure of U.S. sanctions law isn't just about restricting everyone here's ability to do business with Iran. It was about threatening Europeans, Japanese, Koreans from doing business with the United States if they did business with Iran. It's those sanctions we suspended to get to the nuclear agreement. So let's flip the script here. If we start threatening European businesses, Japanese businesses, Koreans, etc., with access to the U.S. market, you're going to see companies withdraw from Iran. And so, from that perspective, the president, if he decides to unilaterally reimpose the sanctions, which he can do legally under U.S. law, if he decides to stop waiving sanctions, because under U.S. law, every 120, every 180 days, you have to waive the sanctions, because otherwise they remain active. If he stops doing that, the sanctions come active again, and again, the threat is made to European and Asian companies. So what I think is true is that he and the United States cannot kill the deal from a legal sense, from the fact that there's this piece of paper and every country agrees to it. But we can remove every ounce of incentive on the part of the Iranians to stay in. Alternatively, let's say our European partners and others decide to stay in, notwithstanding what we might choose to do to them. Well, then he could also choose to kill the deal with a variety of other things. If he were to say, expand U.S. sanctions, not just reimpose them, but expand them such that it's a truly comprehensive embargo. But let's say he were to send the Navy to patrol vessels that are going in and out of Bandar Abbas inside of Iran. There are lots of ways in which he can undermine and damage the JCPOA such that the Iranians withdraw, or that the rest of our partners declare it essentially a good one. Does that help?
The president says this is the worst deal internationally ever negotiated. And he justifies that by saying that we gave 150 billion off the right in front, and we have guaranteed Iran a pathway to getting a nuclear bomb after 10 years. Could you address both things, that we gave 150 billion right up front, and after, you said 15 years, but he says 10.
Right.
Well, and there's a lot of confusion about the number of years.
Sure, no, happy to. So, first off, it's worth noting that if the Iran deal is the worst deal ever, then I'm not sure what about NAFTA, and I'm not sure what about TPP with the Asians as well. I mean, there's a lot of worse deals ever. I think on those 2 points, let's break them down. First, on the $150 billion. What he is erroneously referring to is the amount of money that the US Treasury Department said was restricted for Iran's use as a result of US sanctions, okay? That added up a whole lot of money. It added up gold bars in Iran. It added up cash in Iran. It added up oil money that was Iran's property but was restricted to their access in China, Japan, Korea, Turkey, etc. It added up all of the assets that were frozen in the United States. It added up a lot of different things. And Treasury assessed it at $150 billion, but being honest with you, that was potentially plus or minus 5 or so billion, because we were trying to add gold bars in Iran, and that's not exactly easy to do from Washington, D.C. Our estimate of what the agreement actually freed and that Iran was able to use was about $36 billion. So an order of magnitude less. $36 billion is still a lot, right? It's worth noting that $36 billion, though, is still less than half of the amount of oil money we were restricting pursuant to our sanctions in 2012 alone. So from an Iranian economy perspective, $36 billion is a lot, but it's hardly sufficient. And it's especially not sufficient to manage the liquidity crisis they had in their banks, as well as a lot of unpaid bills that they had back at home. That said, the concern with the $36 billion still becomes, so what is the Iranian plan? What are they going to do with this? And there was an argument made the Iranians are going to essentially hand it over to Hezbollah and hand it over to Hamas. In fact, U.S. intelligence sources said about a month ago that most of the money, based on what we can see, actually went to infrastructure improvements inside Iran. Things like building the subway system in Tehran, improving the airports, etc. But still, this is a persistent concern that folks have raised. A bigger problem really than $150 billion, which is, again, both a mistake as well as a little overwrought, is the bigger question about what's Iran's future economy going to look like. They're a vibrant 80 million person strong economy with pretty good education. What is that going to look like? And I think part of the concern that people have registered is that Iran will be invulnerable to pressure at some point in the future. All links to this $150 billion. It's worth noting, though, that the Iranians have had a pretty hard time tapping the international economy as a result of U.S. sanctions still remain in place. It's also worth noting that the more they are connected to the global economy, that actually is more targets for us to hit if we have to go back down the sanctions path in 10 years. I'll tell you, we couldn't have done the damage we did to them had they not been exposed to the global economy. And so their increased exposure to that economy actually is a huge source of vulnerability. It's not me who's saying this, by the way. The Iranian government itself has said this, and the supreme leader is pretty concerned about it. Now, halfway to the bottom. This upsets me greatly for a number of reasons. First off, the 10-year mark is just flat wrong. The Iranians will not possess sufficient uranium in enriched form to build a bomb until at least year 15, okay? And I'm not going to go through all the technicals here, but if you're looking at what's the most important variable with regard to breakout for a bomb, number of centrifuges is potentially irrelevant at a certain number of machines. The important ingredient is the amount of enriched uranium. We've capped that at 300 kilograms until year 15, okay? You need essentially 1,300 kilograms for one bomb, and the process to go from 300 to 1,300 is a year-long process. So, even if you bought the idea of patient pathway to the bomb, it's still not 10 years, we're talking about 15 years, and it's got to be after that. Beyond all that, the fact that we've got the kinds of inspection regime that we've got in place means that even as they get closer to being back what they were when we did the agreement, which is 2 to 3 months, we're still talking about the ability to have 2 to 3 months of U.S. military response, as opposed to what we would have if we didn't have all this inspector access, which is 2 to 3 months, and we don't know when the clock started, which was our big worry in 2013. And let me get really graphic with you for a second. Back in 2013, a couple of inspectors were driving to a nuclear site in Iran, and there was a car crash. It was snowing, they had a car accident. That happens, right? There was very serious concern in the U.S. intelligence community that it was a planned car crash and that the Iranians were breaking out. And we didn't know what the answer to that was. Another week, inspectors go, they visit the site, we're okay. The Iranians have not, in fact, started the breakout. But that's what, if you're talking to somebody who's really worried about Iranian breakout, that is the thing that you have to watch out of. Not having inspector access, etc. But all of that persists at least for 20 years, going into 25 with regard to specific elements, and in perpetuity with regard to an even different slice of inspector accesses. So in no way is the JCPOA a patient path to the line. It is the biggest set of restrictions on Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons that we have ever had since the first gram of uranium was enriched in the country back in the Bush administration. Does that help?
Additionally, how much of the U.S. money was released to that?
So, yeah, the 150 billion number, which is wrong, and the $36 billion figure, which is right, was all Iranian money. In terms of U.S. money, what people always remember is this $1.7 billion that was paid out. Yeah. So that was, yes, U.S. dollars. It's worth remembering that 400 million of that was giving Iran the money back that they paid us for weapons back under the Shah. And we were under an international arbitration process in which if we hadn't settled for 1.7, it was probably going to be about $10 billion. And considering that we have claims still pending with the Iranians from the hostage crisis, it was considered dangerous for us to flout that kind of requirement. We might not get our share back. I try to add up over the years how much money the Iranians pay us versus we paid them. We're doing all right if you compare over the course of the last 20 years. But in terms of U.S. dollars that flew out of the U.S. Treasury in association with this deal, the number is 1.7. 400 million of which was paying them their money back, and 1.3 billion was the essentially damages and interest that we owed them.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, I've heard from many different sources that the inspectors who go into the centrifuges or whatever the important component is, are actually the Iranians. And that we've got the box, checking on the chicken coop to see if it's locked. It seems bizarre to me. And your reference of the scorpion resonates. They are scorpions, they can't help it. They just cheat, that's what they do. And I think the price is just enormous to the Western civilization.
Yeah, it would have been really crazy had we agreed to exactly what you heard. Fortunately, we didn't. The inspectors who go into Iran's nuclear sites are composed of 200 designated inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, who are those guys? Well, some of them are Japanese, some of them are Brits, some of them are Germans, some of them are Russians, South Africans. It's a mishmash. If you actually went through the inspector list, there's about, I want to say, maybe 20% are Americans, maybe 25% are Europeans, and then it kind of filters from there. And it's all essentially attached to how many people you've got capable of doing the job in your various different countries. Now, we are historically not permitted to have Americans on the inspector teams inside of Iran. And you might say, well, that's really off-putting, until you remember that we don't allow Iranian inspectors, because there are some of them too, to come into U.S. nuclear facilities, which, small wonder we wouldn't do that. But the international inspectors who go are required to provide reports back to the mothership at the IAEA in Vienna. And suffice to say, we've got a very good relationship with the IAEA, and we've got very good understanding as to what they are saying. Beyond all that, the IAEA on a quarterly basis has to provide the output of its reports in a first private and then public report, that we've got other ways of verifying are accurate. And so the bottom line is, in terms of our ability to understand what's going on inside those nuclear facilities, I don't think you have much to worry about. Now, your bigger concern, and where I think the linkage is being made, is to a place called Parchin. And it was there, it's a military site of the Iranians. It's where they test all sorts of stuff. Missile parts, they test artillery, it's a testing range. And there was an agreement in 2015 in which the IAEA worked out with the Iranians a procedure for verifying certain activities in the site, in which IAEA inspectors were not required to be present. The U.S. Oak Ridge National Laboratory validated that that was a sound method of verifying Iranian compliance, as did the U.S. intelligence community. I'm not in a position to describe kind of the details here. But the upshot is that is the only instance in which you could have made an argument that the Iranians were inspecting themselves, and they weren't. It was a misnomer based upon a misunderstanding of what the IAEA had done. But on your average day-to-day inspections, those are conducted by a variety of different nationalities, all of whom are international officers of the IAEA.
Add one thing. You commented that,
Just a minute, we have lots of questions.
okay, sorry. I just wanted to add one caveat. You commented that they don't investigate and inspect us. Therefore, why would we, expect a reciprocal? But they're the bad actors. I'm sure they don't go in and inspect the Japanese reactors. They don't go and inspect the Western European reactors, where the Western European people are inspecting theirs. So I don't understand. It's okay for all the other people to be inspecting, to check on whether Iran is doing the right thing, and the U.S. is not allowed to do that.
Right, so I'd correct you a little bit here. I mean, in fact, there is active inspections of what's going on in Japan, what's going on in Western Europe, what's going on.
By the Iranians?
Yes. There are, last time I looked at this, it was like a handful of people who are IAEA inspectors. And they're dues-paying members of the IAEA, just as they're dues-paying members of the UN, and they're given the ability to inspect those various facilities. The problem is, and we've had this problem a lot before, we don't like the idea of people who are citizens of state sponsors of terrorism wandering around U.S. nuclear facilities. And so back in the 50s, and this is a long time ago, right? Back in the 50s, we organized the same kind of approach with regard to the Soviets, and we said, we're not really comfortable with them inspecting us. So every country under the IAEA Charter, which Eisenhower negotiated, is authorized to say, we don't like the following nationality of inspectors. Now, you can't say that for everybody, because then nobody can inspect you. But you're allowed to essentially say, yeah, but not those guys, right? And so, if you think about it, take it out of this situation, this context. It's not terribly helpful back in 1973 to have Egyptians and Israelis inspecting one another. They're not. Imagine that as a scenario. It's not terribly helpful to try and have various different aspects of Yugoslavia inspecting one another back in the 1990s. So it was considered prudent to give everyone a little bit of space from people they may be warring with, while at the same time allowing for international access to give everybody the ability to say, but not those guys. And from a U.S. perspective, we've been more active than most, to be honest, in denying people access to our facilities, because at various times we wanted Iraqis, Iranians, Syrians, a number of different people from wandering around our facilities, which in my view was decent and good sense. The real problem, the real question is, do we believe these inspectors are going to be able to do a good enough job as they are foreign nationals? And I can tell you based on my experience that most of these folks are, if you can imagine, as tough on the Iranians and others as anybody else. At some point they do leave a little bit of their nationality behind and they become the cops of nuclear things. So for instance, one of the toughest guys with respect to the Iranians is a Finn. He's tougher than some of our own inspectors, and that's because he just doesn't trust those guys. So I wouldn't make the argument that just because an American isn't there, we don't have appropriate access. I do think we do.
Go ahead.
What is your feeling on the following? I think of Iran, or I think most of us do, as a single entity insofar as their government is concerned. But what frightens me is the Quad forces and what part they play in the government, let alone in the subject we're speaking of.
Yeah, so first, I wouldn't agree with the idea that the Iranian government is a unitary actor. It's true that everybody who is a member of the Iranian government, I think with that exception, believes the supreme leader ought to be the supreme leader, and that the current Iranian system is a good one. In that, they're really no different than officials of most governments, and I think most of us would weed people who don't believe in those sorts of things out of our government system. I think there are an awful lot of politics, though, within Iran about what it means to be an Islamic Republic and what it means to have a revolutionary foreign policy. People like Rouhani, for example, or Zarif, are much more comfortable with it being revolutionary in spirit, but not necessarily revolutionary in action. People in the Quds Force are the opposite, right? You know, a lot of these folks believe that the legacy of 1978, 1979 ought to be an expeditionary force that goes out and tries to encourage revolution elsewhere. And so from that perspective, yeah, I think there's a reason to be concerned about the Quds Force. I don't think that you should think of them as a rogue element within the Iranian system, nor would I argue or agree with the idea that they are the force of the Iranian system. They've been checked back before, right? If the Quds Force had their way, it wouldn't have just been IEDs on the roadsides in Iraq, but it would have been bombs falling on our embassies as well. There's a lot that the Quds Force had planned. They were restrained by other elements of the Iranian system that believed that would be a step too far, and that U.S. military response would have been pretty severe had they gone to that next level. There are other examples too, from Afghanistan, from the conflict in Syria, where the Quds Force has in fact been restrained by other aspects of the Iranian system. So none of this is to suggest the Quds Force aren't bad actors. They are. You know, some of their operatives plotted to blow up the fish restaurant in Washington, where I took my wife for Valentine's Day shortly before. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form concerned about, or dismissing the concerns about the Quds Force. But the way I would think about it is as a ultra-hardline group within the Iranian system that are true believers, but that do follow orders, and they do follow the orders of the supreme leader in particular. And over the years, he has restrained them from doing things that they would otherwise like to do. And that means that they are a set of rational actors that can be managed, as opposed to kind of a rogue element that does whatever it wants within the system. Does that make any sense?
Yes, but just to follow up one little point, are you suggesting that their actions in the Persian Gulf with the speedboats going up against our military ships is something that is sanctioned by the Supreme Leader?
Yes, I believe so. I believe it absolutely is. And I think it's intended to do a couple things. One, every time that they do that, they're reminding the U.S. that we don't have it our own way in dealing with Iran. You know, every once in a while, you hear people talk about how we can annihilate the Iranian military in a matter of weeks, which I believe is actually true. And the Iranians feel a need to reestablish deterrence. And I think basically their establishment of deterrence is, yes, but we can wreak havoc on shipping lanes within the Straits of Hormuz, we can mine the straits, and we can make life very hard on you and your allies. Same reason why they will test missile systems shortly after there's talk about airstrikes coming from Israel. I think there is a direct correlation there. Yes, Israel, we acknowledge that you can attack us. We got it. You can. And we can launch missiles at height. And so be careful. You know, you should not feel like you've got a free rein against us. We don't have to like it. We don't have to think that's a positive set of outcomes. But from the standpoint of an Iranian security thinker, I think it makes sense if you're attempting to stop an attack on your country, right? To try and make sure that others know that you have the ability to inflict pain against them as well.
Thank you. As you know, there's a lot of uranium in the world. What's to stop them from buying some uranium secretly from the Soviet Union or somewhere else? Because there's a huge amount of uranium available.
Yeah. This actually was one of my obsessions when I was in government. Before I went to the White House, I was the Middle East team chief for the Non-Proliferation Bureau at the State Department. And we made a absolute laser-like focus on restraining Iran's ability to get uranium supplies. So we track this very vigorously. Everything from natural uranium that's coming out of the ground, which would take an awful lot of work to try and make into something more serious, up to and including things like HEA, right? You know, highly enriched uranium that's already ready for bombs. There are a variety of technical detectors that exist, including at ports all around the world, that would potentially detect uranium that is going through, both highly enriched as well as natural uranium that comes out of the ground. And There is a very vigilant intelligence presence on this. Now, does that mean that there isn't some possibility of them buying it anyway? Yes, right? That is a risk, that is a possibility. So we did two things to guard against them being able to do anything with that uranium once it gets into Iran. Everything that's part of the known Iranian nuclear program is under 24/7 monitoring by the international inspectors. And that means that if they get that uranium from Kazakhstan or they get it from South Africa, and they decide to try and bring it in, the IAEA is going to ask, well, where'd that come from? Why? Because every gram of uranium that is produced inside of Iran is also subject to IAEA verification and inspection. Meaning we know of all the uranium that's in the country now, and all the uranium that they're mining. So we can track everything that they're producing. We'll know that they've got something from the outside. Is there a possibility that there is some truly secret, no one's ever heard of, parallel nuclear program operating inside of Iran? Yes. But like many things, the fact that we have absolutely no indication of it makes it kind of hard to plan policy against it, first off. And second off, it's not because we're not looking. We were able to detect and respond to Iran's development of its last two covert uranium enrichment facilities before a single centrifuge was ever installed within them. And so I think you might hear a lot of negative things about the U.S. Intelligence Committee. On this one, we've done pretty well. And I think we've got a pretty good record of being able to detect these things before they get too far afield. There's no guarantee of that. There's no guarantee if we didn't have a nuclear agreement, we would have that problem too.
Now, the problem we have with North Korea, and we are trying to peacefully, hopefully, to come up with an agreement. But with the president acting like this, which an agreement was already made, what incentive the North Korean have to come to an agreement? The second part of it is, why we don't use Iran's effect, like to defeat ISIS, as well as help in Afghanistan, as well as in Kosovo, which Clinton administration did. Why we don't take that approach, but all the time we are going for pushing Iran for confrontation and essentially to a war.
Yeah. So with regard to the first one, I do share the concern that we're giving the wrong signals to the North Koreans. Admittedly, though, this isn't the worst of our signals. I actually think the more dangerous signal is constantly talking about fire and fury, et cetera, and you know, a potential for a direct U.S. preemptive nuclear strike on North Korea, which has been actively talked about. Those are the kinds of signals that, in my view, tell the North Koreans you're on the right track. That, you know, the record of U.S. military action against people possessing nuclear weapons is fairly modest. The record of U.S. military action against people considering nuclear weapons is pretty high, at least in relative terms. So that, to me, is the bigger disincentive we're putting out to the North Koreans. We're, I think, giving them every security concern in the world to keep on going and to make sure that you've got a hydrogen bomb you're capable of lobbing at San Francisco before you're willing to enter into any kind of direct talk. I do think the idea that the North Koreans pay complete attention to what's going on in the Iran case and other cases is a little overstated. My experience with most bureaucracies is that they're pretty well focused on their own problems, and that what they hear from other places is a little bit more secondhand, but I do think it's an issue that's worth keeping in the back of our minds. To me, it's just not the biggest one. On, you know, working with the Iranians and other places. You know, I don't want to give the impression that I think the Iranians are an unvarnished positive actor in the region that we can do business with. They're not. We have different interests, and we have different interests about the outcome of what's going to happen in Iraq and what's going to happen in Syria. We are both aligned against ISIS, and it's part of the reason why there's been this tacit coordination through the Iraqis about what we're going to do, and there's been a tacit coordination with the Russians about what we're going to do in Syria, and that to some extent is breaking down as ISIS is in fact retreating back to its core. And I think that we could have used the opportunity, just as we did with Afghanistan, we did with Kosovo, to try and explore a new security arrangement and a security dialogue at a minimum with the Iranians. I don't think that just because we had a common enemy, it would have solved all those problems. And I think that you would find pretty quickly that we've got sharply divergent views about what Syria ought to look like after the conflict is over. Western Iraq ought to look like after the conflict is over. So to me, there was a possibility of some coordination, a possibility of it being a start for negotiations. To me, it's a little overstated to say we've got these common enemies so we could have worked together in a more overt sense. There's a little too much bad blood, but also disagreement over a lot of issues for that to, in my view, be fruitful.
I think you've explained magnificently well that, the case for this whole deal, so to speak. And I'm sure it was intelligently planned once the decision was made, including your comments on inspection, double checking, and so on and so forth. So the question is, why was there such a strong argument going the other way? And were they intelligent or stupid? My comment is a little bit confusing, or I'm a little confused. The key point to me is this, that obviously it's deferred. Some people say 10 years, your comment is up to 20 years. The people who take the opposite view claim that what we've done is strengthen Iran and paid the price for a deferral by strengthening them. And proof of that is, I think, the sanctions have been tailed back by European countries. So it strengthened them economically, and of course, they're building up their strength, which means that at the end of a certain period, being 10 or 20 years, they may be stronger than they are today, which gives them more power. Certainly, their position in Syria is aggressive, to say the least. Their commitment to eliminate Israel is certainly a factor, and certainly the tremendous factions that are now emerging in Iraq are factors of strength. So that I appreciate your commenting on the argument, also intelligent, which goes the other way, which is really a deferral of the inevitable.
Yeah. No, look, what I would say is I think there were as many intelligent arguments against as there were stupid arguments against, just as there were as many intelligent arguments for as there were stupid arguments for. I have found extremes on both sides of this issue irritating, to say the least, including people who said that we had no options to deal with Iran if we didn't go with this agreement. That's not true. We had options. Our options, though, were not as attractive as the option that we pursued. Do we have the option, for instance, to military strike Iran's nuclear program and to knock it out as it's presently configured? Yes, we do. The problem is that you do that and 2 to 3 years later, you've got a nuclear program that's emerging that you might not know about because the IAEA's been kicked out and because the NPT is no longer the operative law in Iran. You don't have a nuclear non-proliferation treaty in Iran. They no longer have a legal obligation not to pursue nuclear weapons. The same way that North Korea, the same way Israel, the same way that Pakistan and India have been outside of the NPT. So, to me, it wasn't about, is this the only way of addressing this problem? No, there were lots of other ways of doing it. It was the best way, and the best option that we had at the moment in time. Now, on the intelligent arguments against, the last thing I sent to Undersecretary Wendy Sherman, as I was leading the negotiating team in 2015, was a little email that said basically Richard's thoughts on what we ought to do and what we ought to not do in the agreement as you guys are finishing. The number one thing was the issue of sunsets, which is this issue. What happens in 10 years, what happens in 15 years, or what happens in 20, 25 years? And I said, this is the issue that will kill us. It will be the issue that harms us with the American population, it will be the issue that harms us with Congress. And that's in fact what has transpired. My view is that people who say, well, what about 10 years, 15 years, 20, 25 years from now, are kind of leaving themselves open to pushback because the argument that comes back is, well, you'd like to have that problem now, as opposed to 10, 15, 20, 25 years. If we walk out of the nuclear agreement with the Iranians today, we will have the problem that people are focused on, which is Iran being this close to a bomb, today. And it's not apparent to me that the Middle East can more tolerate that situation now than it's going to be able to tolerate in 15, 20, 25 years, whenever that might transpire. So to me, that's one argument in critique back. The second argument in critique back that I have is that we're forgetting something here, which is that every arms control arrangement negotiated by the United States, period, has involved some kind of sunset, or it has not been legally binding, and it's been more advisory. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty itself had a 25-year expiration period, right? Which meant that in 25 years, 1995, we could have had German nuclear weapons, we could have had Brazilian nuclear weapons, any number of them. We bought into that back in the 1970s because we made a decision that it was impossible to achieve a universal prohibition at that time, and we might not want one. In fact, at the time, there was a thought, well, maybe we want West Germany to have nuclear weapons. We don't know what the Soviets are going to look like. And so we agreed on a sunset period of 25 years because it made sense at the time. But in the early 90s, it didn't make sense for the United States. So what did we do? We then pursued negotiations to make it permanent. And the NPT is now permanent. It will last until forever, right? To me, the nuclear agreement with the Iranians could have, and may still possibly, pursue the same path. Why? It's not apparent to me it's in the Iranian interest to cause nuclear proliferation in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, etc., right? And the Iranians have that risk if in 10 years, they're off to the races. If they start building centrifuges at a rapid clip, they are going to prompt all those other countries to say, well, we need to level up. In fact, the Saudis have already said that. And I don't think we've shown in the last few years an ability to control Saudi policy, or Emirati policy. And so if you're an Iranian, you have to ask yourself a question. Am I happier with my security environment today under the nuclear agreement, its restrictions, or am I happier under your Saudi, Emirati race with us towards nuclear weapons? Now the Iranians are further along, but if you had Saudi money and you had Emirati money, who would you make a bet on in the end being able to advance themselves faster and be able to threaten the other side? So I think there's an argument to be made that the sunsets, and it might never were intended to be, but that the sunsets never have to be reached. That we can negotiate a follow-on arrangement with the Iranians. And that ought to be the preoccupation of our policy. Because then, I'll stop after this, what is the risk we face if we don't do this, right? Well, we face the Iranians having a more integrated global economy and being stronger as a result of that. But as I said earlier, that also is more targets to hit. Right? The fact that the Russians were in as debt as much as they were in Western Europe and New York meant when we decided to impose debt sanctions on the Russians in 2014, combined with an oil price drop, we crashed the Russian ruble, right? And we put a lot of damage on the Russians in a very short period of time. That's a pretty big economy, right? I think we would have the ability to do the same thing to the Iranians. And even if you don't believe that we have a sanctions option then, I can assure you we would have a military option. Because it's not like the U.S. Air Force is going away anytime soon. And the fact of the matter is that the agreement has given us more information and access to Iranian nuclear facilities than we had previously. And so if you had to think about erecting a target list now, you would be better off as a result of the JCPOA than not. And so in that world, we may be 2 to 3 years away from an Iranian nuclear bomb after we strike in 15 or 20 years. But still, I'm a simple guy. I'll take that risk in the year 2045 as opposed to that risk in the year 2018.
We have time for one more question on the other side.
This is a maybe a 2 or 3 part question.
No, just one part, yeah.
Do the Iranians have any options like we do to say we want to get out and play the card of that the Europeans, what have you, may drag their feet on sanctions and especially with all the leadership changes that happen in Iran, are we also headed for a little bit of a the Ayatollah being sort of a big rocket man kind of scenario with President Trump?
Yeah, so yes, the Iranians have a similar amount of leverage to threaten to withdraw from the agreement. This was called, when we were negotiating a nuclear blackmail, that the Iranians could say, we'll withdraw unless you do something else for us. The problem is that for practical reasons, until maybe today, the Iranians have not had the ability to play that card really well, because the context for the international environment, if they do that, is going to be against them. Let's say that the Iranians were to say, we're going to withdraw from the nuclear agreement unless you stop imposing sanctions on all of our banks for any reason. And we say, no, your banks are associated with terrorism, we're going to keep the sanctions in place. And the Iranians were to withdraw. From the perspective of selling this to the international community, that's a pretty strong position to have. I'd love to have that position. Because then when you go to the Europeans, you're saying, we didn't start this problem, they did. Also, their terrorism banks can be free. Now, that's pretty good. I like that. That helps me if I'm attempting to erect a pressure strategy against them. And so what have we actually seen practically from the Iranian perspective? They've complained an awful lot about us not helping them get enough access to banks, et cetera. But they've never pulled this nuclear blackmail card out of the pack, and I think that's because they know that our position is just simply that much stronger. Now, I say that based on the context today. If 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, whatever, we have a much worse relationship with the Europeans, we've withdrawn from the JCPOA ourselves, we are doing things that make it seem like we're the bad guys, then in my view, that context doesn't exist, and I think we'd be much weaker as a result of all that.
I'd like to give you a small token of our appreciation for your coming this evening, and thank you very much, and appreciate you.